For this section, you're going to want to have a copy handy of a quantitative study, one that has a methodology in it. That's one of the sections that you'd be looking for. A journal article that actually has data in it as a survey or some kind of tables or statistical work within it. Other studies work as well, but we're going to be looking at specific quantitative data, so it might be of good help to you to have one handy, and then as we go through each of the next steps, stop and look at that example and see if you can find that within or practice that within that example. So once you have an article and you've looked at it and you've decided that you're ready to read it, what you and I and most people would do is start at the first word and read through until eventually you decide whether it's going to be helpful to you or not. That's not a very efficient way of doing things. You know, when I can remember very plainly reading research, going through, reading pages and pages of literature and background and so forth, finally getting to the middle to say what it was they were doing and go, oh, that's not what I thought this study was at all. I also have the strong memory of reading through the beginning parts and getting into the statistical part, having no idea what all that jargon was, skipping over that whole part and jumping right to the conclusions, and just having to hope that the study that was done, it was a valid and reliable one that I could use. Neither one of those are very helpful, so let's look at something a little more systematic than that. First thing that you have that article in front of you is you should preview it. I used to teach children to do something called SQ3R, where you skim, you ask yourself a question, you read, recite, and then review to help them learn how to read nonfiction, how to read textbooks, how to read technical manuals, those types of things. That wasn't a bad way of learning, and this kind of reminds me of that. But this first idea is that you're going to preview it and not waste your time on stuff that isn't going to end up being helpful or useful to you in the end. So when you preview, you first of all think about the purpose of what you're doing and what you've already done. There's no reason to read another article when you already have stacks of evidence that you can cite. But as you're writing, if you find that you aren't having evidence in an area, you know you haven't read enough. On this case, you're going to be saying, what specifically are you reading this for? Is it for background? Is it for, you want to see if you could replicate it? Is there an instrument in it that you might want to use? Obviously, in this case, it's because your professor assigned you to read a sample one, but we'll pretend that's not the real purpose. When you evaluate the title, you're going to be looking to see if there are key variables that are in there that are helpful. There are also sometimes good ideas of finding synonyms for the words that you're using so that you can research farther. Like one study that talks about values, and you've been using the word attitudes, it opens up a new search base for you to use, another term for you to use as you're searching. Then you read the section titles. Now, if you look through, you'll basically see that they follow the 5 chapters of a dissertation. That there's an introductory part, there's some background literature, there should be some kind of thing that says methodology or procedures or something like that, followed by the results and followed by their conclusions or discussion or whatever they want to call that so what part of it. They follow the same pattern. So look through your article now and see if you said, if this was a dissertation, where's chapter 1, where's 2, where's 3, and most generally you will find that all 5 pieces are there, and they are there in order. That's why we're on quantitative. Qualitative does not always follow the pattern quite so exactly, but quantitative usually does. After you look at the titles and you think, well, this looks interesting, I might want to read this, then these are the places where I'm going to read a little more deeply. So far I've skimmed really fast. So then I read the abstract. Now the abstract is not always tell you all of the conclusions, but it gives you a sense of what type of study it is. It'll say right in there what kind of a survey it is, or what what type of qualitative it is, if it's qualitative, or if it's a mixed methods, it'll tell you which methods they used. And it will also give you a sense of whether they're in the same ballpark as you are. Reading the first paragraph usually talks about why is this study important. They've written it to try to pull you in and say this study matters. And if you get to the end of it and you think it doesn't, then it may be time to go somewhere else. An important place to look is what was the purpose of the study? Why were the authors putting this study onto paper? Generally, you can find it at the end of the introduction, and they'll say something like, therefore, the purpose of this study is to whatever, after they've laid out the need for the study. It is sometimes immediately before the methodology section. So this is another good time to stop and look and see if you can find what the purpose of the study was. If we can't find a purpose to the study, there's a kind of a red flag that maybe this is going to be a difficult study for you to be able to use well. The design is talking about looking into the methodology a little bit. You know, how many students did they study? How many years? What year was this done? You know, what state was it done in, or nation? And you know, to kind of get a feel for, is this something that's going to be something that's I can generalize from. And finally, in the discussion, I'm going to go through that quickly to see if they're coming up with conclusions that I, again, will think is useful as I'm writing. If you see if those signs are all favorable, then it is time to actually read the entire report. If it's suiting the purpose of what you're looking for, you will have favorable responses in all of those things. If you don't, by the way, it's not time to throw it away. If you pick this article, for example, the one in front of me right now that says motivational effects of test scores on elementary students, and I find that it's not a real savvy report, or I find that it's not exactly what I want to talk about, I'm still probably going to, let's say I'm doing some type of paper on assessment, probably someplace in my literature review I'll say something like, many researchers have looked at what helps raise student achievement and what helps students create higher assessment scores. Well, I just laid out there to my readers that there are many researchers that have studied this. I could use those authors of this study. I'm not going to use the study itself, but they can help me say that many people have studied this. And then I can cite them there, and I can put them in my references so that people want to look at other models besides the ones that I'm going to really go after. So I'm not going to throw these things away, even if they aren't something that I'm going to hang my hat on and really, spend paragraphs discussing in my paper. And so then I'm going to read critically. When I read critically, I print the thing out, and I have different colored highlighters at my fingertips. And I know that I'm looking for certain things. One of the things that I'm looking for is background information, literature type of things. And when I was looking through that in my dissertation, I would highlight those things in pink, and I actually got to be more specific as I got to be more understanding what my lit review was about. I actually had different variables within my lit review that I used different notation for. But I'd highlight my lit review in pink, and I'd highlight anything that talked about why is this a problem in yellow, and anything that was like a good instrument or a good survey or a good study, that I'd mark that stuff in green. And then things that I thought were great for conclusions, like the so what's of this whole thing in other studies, I want to use some of that kind of stuff in my conclusions to give evidence in my conclusions. I mark that in blue. And I used flags, those little paper flags that you get, like little teeny post-it notes, and I put those along the edge, and then I would highlight. And sometimes in one article, it'd be a rainbow. I'd have lots of different colors within there. But the nice thing about that pattern And that sequence of doing things is when I wanted to do something, I could pull all the yellow ones and I didn't have to weed through all the articles to find the ones. And the second thing it said there where it says add new information and delete the incorrect is I would write right on the front of that article. I would say, look at so-and-so's conclusion, or there's a great quote on, or I'm keeping this because it will work if my conclusions are significant. Where other ones would say this would refute if my conclusions are significant, or those types of things. So I would be able to remember I read so many things over so many months. I needed to have that kind of information on there so that as the piles got higher and deeper around me, I could remember what the point was without having to do much rereading. Now, other people have done other things. They've done electronic databases, they've done note cards. There's many different ways of doing it, but some way you want to keep things in some kind of organization. It starts out as a mess, and the farther and farther you go along, the more and more refined you get. That's real, but you don't want to keep letting things be a mess and just being piles and going through and through things again. So if we're going to look at this quantitative study, we're going to look and see whether this is a study we want to use in our work or not. There are some specific things that we can look for. Now, in your handout, there is a nice list about questions to ask yourself about critiquing. In quantitative specifically, it's the same things that we talked about in Chapter 3, that it's the participants or the subjects or your sample, the instruments or the tests or the tools, and the procedures on how they collected and analyzed the data. Those are the three things you look at and to see whether it's a good study or not. Be very careful not to over-critique that. I've had people that threw out studies that were really good because they'd say, well, there was only 25 in the study, and I know from stats that you have to have 30 to have a sample. That's not necessarily so. You're told in statistics that there are certain numbers that you need to make good sense of certain kinds of tests. But there are times where it doesn't suit the purpose. For example, if I were going to ask people who's going to be the next president, a sample of 30 isn't going to do me a whole lot of good to come to any conclusions. On the other hand, if I want to say, what effect does one-to-one technology have on math students, math scores for students that speak another language besides English as their primary language? I may only have 23 students in the whole school that could be my sample. So you just have to watch again how much they generalize out of it, what their purpose is, and take things with a grain of salt. There is no magic number for sample. The list that you see of the common shortcomings have been validated over and over that these are the things that people see when a study is poor in quantitative. What oftentimes I notice in student work is that the research design does not match the question of what they really want to know. There was a study done out of another university that said across the top of it, and all the background work and everything with that said it was all about parent involvement and how parent involvement helps student achievement. The actual methodology of what they did was one group of parents, they brought them to school and did in-services and teaching them how to teach their children, and the other group did not get that. Well, really, what that showed, they looked at the reading, whether there was significant growth in reading between the two groups. That really didn't show parent involvement because they didn't have any idea whether the group that didn't get the in-service may have been the most involved parents. It didn't match up. What that study should have been on was adult learning, whether direct instruction helps parents in instructing their children, etc. But when they don't match up, then the whole thing falls apart. And so these are not only the things that you want to watch for when you're reading, but they're also pitfalls when you're writing. Both as a consumer and a producer, of research. These common mistakes tear apart the case that you're building, that you're trying to logically build in a study. And so that there's a reason why in a dissertation you're doing things so step by step and having each piece of it so clearly stated. It sometimes seems redundant, but it is to try to keep these types of things from being shortcomings, well, shortcuts too, in your study, so that you have something that other people will also want to replicate or read, or at least feel that you have done something that adds to the body of knowledge.